we are here joined with Daniel Spreadbury. He is the product marketing manager for Dorico, Steinberg's new professional music notation software. He has worked in the field of music notation software for nearly 20 years after graduating with a music degree from University College, Oxford, and joined Steinberg in late 2012 along with the other remaining members of the original Sibelius development team after Avid's decision to close the Sibelius development office. Daniel, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for having me. It's great to be here.
I am so excited by Dorico because Dorico is a completely new game changer when it comes to music notation software. And in fact, it's so new that I had no idea doing research for this interview that Sibelius and Finale have some very old code, right? In their, I guess I'm not a programmer, but database, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Finale was first invented in like 1987, 88, so that's 30 years ago this year. Yeah, wow. And Sibelius actually started around the same time that the twin brothers who invented Sibelius did it when they were school kids, also in the 80s. I mean, Sibelius wasn't available to buy until the early 90s, but yeah, it also started basically 30 years ago. So yeah, they're pretty old school. And
that's not to take anything away from this groundbreaking software. I mean, of course, they've done wonderful things in this field, but it makes it very difficult to patch and add new things, right? Because if you've got a foundation that's pretty old, it makes adding new features and I would imagine that's difficult, right?
Yeah, I think the challenge really is when you have that much stuff, never mind how old it is, it's just the scope of it. And when you're adding things, you find it difficult to work out all of the existing areas of functionality that your new functionality might touch. So regressions, where something that used to work doesn't work anymore because of something you did would be a common problem. And also just generally not being able to tell, hey, will this affect something else or not? Because I think it's fair to say that, in a way, software development is still a very young discipline, really, as a broad discipline. It's like, half a century old. And obviously the technology is changing so fast in that area. But I think some people in the software industry would probably argue that our ability to kind of write code is maybe not keeping pace with the sort of development of technology. In other words, the tools aren't getting necessarily better as quickly as the technologies are advancing. Yeah, it's a real challenge. I mean, I'm not a programmer myself, really. I dabble with a bit of UI stuff when the team lets me. but I'm fortunate to work with these guys guys and girls, I should say, who are just incredibly dedicated, experienced, and like me, they've pretty much worked in this field for their whole career, more or less.
Now, you must have had a first-hand experience with what the programmers have to deal with, because they're the technical side and they need to worry about how to implement new things that customers want, and they really have to really work within the constraints, right?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, the way that we tend to work is that we listen to customer feedback every which way we can get it. So I and other members of the team talk to people directly on Twitter. That's how you and I first got in touch, was via Twitter. Right. Also, we have a forum on our website, and we get a lot of feedback every day from there, questions and feedback and stuff. Facebook as well is a huge thing these days. Of course, none of this was around when I started. When I started, I was doing tech support. It was letters and faxes. Literally, in the morning, I would come into work and open the post and see what letters I needed to write, and then print them out, and then go to the post office and post them at the end of the day. It's changed so much. And but yeah, absolutely. The way we tend to work is we get this feedback from customers, and it basically sort of all one way or another it comes through me, and we figure out sort of what priority we want to give to the things that we need to work on. And then we have a very collaborative approach to figuring out how we're going to do stuff. I might say, hey, I think it would be good if this could work a bit like this. Could we, do it with a popover from here, or could we have, this option that affects this thing but not that thing? And then we'll kind of sit down and have a good chat about it. And the developers will be sort of, their little brains, or their big brains, I should say, will be ticking over all of the possibilities of the things that we've talked about. And then, they go away and we come back together normally a few days later, and maybe they've got bits of it working already, or maybe we need to review bits of the design, and it then becomes an iterative process basically. And yeah, I mean, I'm full of admiration and respect for the work that the team do, because being a musician, really more than a technical person myself, to see something where on a Monday we talk about something and sort of dream up how it might work, and then maybe, depending on what it is, maybe you see something the next day or maybe the next week, and certainly when you start to see these things that you've collaborated on together being brought to life for the first time. There are a few days that I can still remember over all the time we've been doing this, like the first time we saw the dynamic parts feature in Sibelius work, which is now 14 years ago or something like that. Goodness. And the first time we saw that work was like a really exciting day, because oh yeah, this idea we had and this approach that we've come up for doing it, it's going to work, or at least here's the first fruits of the work that have gone into making it work. And those days are always really exciting, because the thing with software is you're dreaming the entire thing up. It's completely constructed. There is nothing, there's no raw material except for your own ideas. Everything is constructed from scratch, and that is really, really an amazing thing.
I remember when I was in college and we were all buying Finale. Finale was the one that we had, we were made to buy. But I remember there were other students, and this is 10 years ago, they were saying, man, Sibelius is great. It's so much better than Finale. It's so much user friendly. And you were on that team when that was going on. And I get the sense, I always got the sense that Sibelius was better than Finale, and this is just purely anecdotal. And you were on the Sibelius team at the time, but I can say pretty much everyone is saying that Sibelius at the time was just more easy to use than Finale.
I think better is obviously kind of a subjective term, right. And there's no denying that both Finale and Sibelius are, given how mature they are and how much effort and brain power and everything has been poured into them over the decades, there's almost nothing that they can't do. And I think that the thing that sort of separates them is that Finale is very much, I mean, it is basically, if you look at it, it still looks more or less the same way it did when Phil Farron invented it, because he was looking at the Mac applications of the day. Things like Aldous PageMaker was brand new when Finale was around. This whole idea of desktop publishing had literally only really just been invented a couple of years before with the advent of the laser writer printer and Aldous coming out with PageMaker. And so you look at Finale, and Finale is quite plainly the music version of Aldous PageMaker, with some fairly idiosyncratic design choices made along the way. But it kind of still looks the same now, 30 years later. I mean, obviously they've done a huge amount of work on it, and it's been, robustly modernized and so on. But you can see those roots are there. You
mentioned they can do anything. It's really changed though, right? Over the last 20 years. How is notation software completely different 10, 20 years ago compared to today?
Yeah, well, I think obviously, just the speed that computers go at now, and all of the technologies, the internet, of course, has made a huge difference. Right. I mean, it was when I started at Sibelius, which was very nearly 20 years ago. It was the revolutionary idea that one of the very, at that time, very small programming team working with Jonathan Finn, one of the two brothers who'd founded the company. They had this idea of doing a Netscape plugin that would be able to show your Sibelius scores on the internet. And this was in the time before people really had. Certainly, there was no broadband. It was all dial-up internet and all this kind of stuff. And that was like a revolutionary thing. And the fact that then we did things like Unicode, so we could do a Japanese version, and this was like a huge
different languages.
Exactly. That was a sort of a hugely big deal. But I mean, when I started there, Sibelius didn't do things like, didn't really do guitar tab, for example, which of course Dorico doesn't yet do either. And there were things that, I mean, I suppose the biggest difference, I mean, I sort of look at the history of what we did, at least with Sibelius, and Finale kind of tended to copy along what we did. And there were really two enormous changes in that period of time. The first was the way that part extraction worked was radically changed. And we mustn't forget that part extraction itself, which is where you take your full score and then you make the individual parts for the players to play from. The fact that Finale could do that kind of overnight in 1988 was an enormous improvement compared to taking your 400 bar symphonic movement and then employing a team of copyists to do it by hand, which is what you did prior to that. So the fact that you could go and basically make a pot of coffee and wait while your Mac Plus churned through one part every 15 minutes or something and hope that it didn't crash or run out of memory, this was an incredible revolution and really did change the way things worked.
Wow. Did you work with any famous composers who were interested in the technology and all that time in Sibelius? Did you work with any renowned composers?
Yeah, I was very, very lucky to meet a number of people because the great thing about, and I'm sure it's the same with the Finale guys as well. Musicians really latched onto the software and really wanted to to embrace it because it was going to make their lives so much easier. So I was very fortunate to meet a lot of really wonderful musicians, who I admire very much. Here in the UK there were people like John Rutter, who still uses Sibelius. In fact, still uses the Acorn version of Sibelius for some things. The late great Michael Kamen, he was the first of the sort of Hollywood composers I was lucky enough to meet, and he always said, Sibelius would have used Sibelius, which was always such a lovely thing to have said. And I think he's probably right. And obviously I met also great people like, Michael Tilson Thomas, who used it for a lot of his concert work, as well as, of course, being a phenomenal conductor. He's also a tremendous composer as well. So, there are so many, and also people in the sort of the rock and pop fields, songwriters, all sorts of people, really, really amazing. And that's one of the fantastic things about making a tool that is useful for musicians is that, every kind of musician, from undergraduate students or even, secondary school students all the way up to top professionals, can make use of that tool. And if you're very lucky, sometimes you hear from them,
From creative people, for a creative musician, this is truly a wonderful, wonderful thing. And now let's actually go to the present now with Dorico. And I'm very curious now. Now, you guys have been working on it since, I guess, 2012. Is that right?
Yeah,
then you had,
that's right.
When did the first version drop?
October 2016, so it was pretty much four years.
Still very new software.
Is.
And you guys have been churning out the updates, which are fantastic. The 1.2 and some small, the queuing, right, is a very big update recently that's been released.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was saying a moment ago that I think if you look at the big innovations over the last kind of 15 years or whatever in scoring software, changing how we did part extraction so that the parts and the score were in the same file, that was a big deal. We did that first in Sibelius. Then another few years on, we made it so that nothing bumped into each other anymore, so all of the automatic collision avoidance with the magnetic layout feature and so on. And although Finale still doesn't have that one, it does have the linked parts feature. And so musicians start to assume that those tools are just kind of part of the furniture, but of course they're hard implemented. They took a long time to design and to implement. And so, of course, when Dorico comes out in 2016, it really has to kind of start from there. We can't go backwards and not have part extraction or not have the ability to make parts and so on. And in fact, if we just had part extraction and not parts in the same file, that would seem like a step backwards. And if we want people who are using Sibelius or Finale to give Dorico a try, obviously we can't ask them to really have much less efficient workflows than they've been used to. So the queuing feature that you mentioned is another thing where we sort of try to then take another step forward. So if making parts in the score the same file was one thing, and making collision avoidance automatic another thing, and Dorico in fact builds on collision avoidance by also doing it for staves and systems as well as just for items attached to staves. So even the vertical dimension of your layout is handled automatically by Dorico, which it isn't by any other program. Then when we came to add cues, we heard from our users loud and clear when the first version came out, hey, this is all very well, I can make parts that are formatted really nicely, but because I can't include cues to show to show other people when they should play. And Dorico, the approach that we tend to take is that, again, contrary to Finale, where you can kind of pretty much do anything graphically you like, you can shrink things, you can drag things anywhere. In Dorico, our approach is more to try to model really the musical stuff. So, if you want to have a cue, it's not like is in Finale where you kind of follow a 12-step process to, put this stuff in another voice and make it small and then use the special tool to move this and that. We wanted it to simply be, hey, you're the user, you want a cue, you tell Dorico you want a cue, and it just does everything else for you. And really the queuing features that we added in Dorico 1.2 are really, they're pretty cool, even if I do say so myself. And I can't take any credit for doing the work on them, but the team did incredible work on that feature, because the really neat thing about it is you literally just say, you can even get Dorico to suggest to you where would be a good place for a cue. So it can actually work out how much time has elapsed since a player last played something. And then it can say, hey, look, the flute hasn't played for 40 seconds. Maybe you want to put a cue in. And it then even tells you, hey, and also playing at the moment are, the horns and the trombones and the violins, and then you can simply say, okay, put in the horns, and that's it. All you have to do is say put in the horns. Everything else is done automatically for you. And the really cool thing is that cue is actually dynamically linked, or basically is a reference to that material in the other instrument. So then if you get to the first rehearsal and it turns out that the horn part now changes because there was a wrong note or because you decided to make a revision, whatever it might be, any cue based on that material will automatically change, just like having your score and your parts in the same file is a huge time saver. Now you can put cues in. Before you might wait until the very, very last moment, if you do it at all, to put the cues in. But now there's no penalty to putting in a cue at any time, because you're never going to have to revise it again. Anything that you do in the full score that would require that cue to be updated will automatically get updated. So it's another step change.
I want to go a step back and let's look at the three main things. There's Dorico, Sibelius, and Finale. Now, what is the unique? I use Dorico, but I don't think I'm a power user by any stretch. I do really, every day I'm learning something new. I'm really enjoying the videos that you guys release and all the hangouts and the webinars you guys give is absolutely brilliant. But if you were to explain it to like a college kid, what if you were to take these three competing softwares? What is the unique selling point for Dorico versus these older music notation softwares?
I think there's three big ones basically. The first one is that it's a more flexible environment for composing and arranging, and I'll talk a bit more about each of these in a minute perhaps. The first one, as I say, more flexible for composing and arranging. Second is that the music just looks better. It looks more like real published music, which means that musicians read it more easily.
I'm going to jump in as you explain these things. What was the reason that computer, and I could notice this, that why was it that previously music that was printed from Sibelius and Finale just didn't quite look right? It didn't look as beautiful as those old engraved scores.
I think, well, it's hundreds of reasons, it's hundreds of little tiny details that I think part of it is that, we had the great fortune of starting in the second decade of the 21st century with, firstly, between us, on the team, probably 100 years combined experience of working in this field, but secondly also all of the technological stuff, the shoulders of all these previous efforts, all of the amazing technologies we could build on. So we simply looked at it and we said, well, it's not good enough if we simply make the music look like it was done by Finale or Sibelius. What can we do to make the music look more natural, more human, more warm, more beautifully balanced, more proportioned, so that the user who is never, these days it's basically impossible pretty much to get an apprenticeship in music engraving in the way that it would have been taught by the major music publishers even 50 years ago, even 30 years ago, simply because technology has effectively eradicated the role of the manual engraver.
Where did you guys go to do that research, to look at manuals of engraving or the ancient art of engraving? How do you guys research that?
Yeah, it's difficult. We did as much as we could in person. So there are still people around there. Some of them are, some of the people who, if they hear this, would be upset that I said they were getting on a bit now. But, there are people who are doing it, at the tail end of the manual era, just at the transition to computer stuff. Right. So, and some of them carried on doing it into the computer era, and some of them are even still doing it now. And some of them kind of sort of tailed away.
Wow.
So we find people that we can actually talk to. We've been to various publishers and looked through their archives. I spent a lot of time at the British Library looking at manuscripts and finding research papers and other sort of documents written about what was done. And then, quite apart from anything else, literally using our eyes and using our experience as musicians and really trying to pinpoint the details that make that one page of music look better than another page of music, and then try to find a way of codifying those into algorithms and things so that the software can do that without the individual user ever needing to gain that experience.
It's true. I mean, it looks beautiful. Dorico looks absolutely beautiful, and I just marvel at it. I wonder how much of the thought and the thinking you guys put into that. It must have been tremendous.
I mean, to give you an example, just working on, say, I mean, the way that we approach is that we try to break it down into lots and lots of small problems. It's always much easier to sort of try and solve a big problem by breaking it up into small pieces. The way that we do it in Dorico is we have, I think now, something like 150 little different specialized engines, each of which does just one job. Like one of them figures out which side of the stem a note should go. One of them figures out where should the rhythm dots go. One of them figures out how should the accidentals be stacked up to the left of this particular configuration of notes, and so on. And to give you an example of one of the ones that really took a long time, I think Andras, one of our programmers, spent basically 1 year just working on slurs.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So, the thing is that if you think about it in terms of time that a human engraver would have learned, like, for example, one of the chaps we spoke to used to work for Halston, who still do a lot of the origination of music for a bunch of different publishers here in the UK, and they're based a million miles away from where I am now in Amersham in Buckinghamshire. And they used to do this famous method called the Halston method, which is a stenciled method. And in fact, if you look on YouTube, there's some old Open University videos from the UK that show the Halston method. And they basically did everything double the size with brushed ink through stencils and so on. And of course, things like slurs couldn't be done with stencils. They had to be freehand drawn. And if you were an engraver at Halston, you would have to work there for 5 years before they would let you do slurs.
Wow. Nobody thinks about these things. I don't think I've never thought about all the hard work that just went into engraving, but that's incredible.
Yeah,
it's incredible.
So
I stopped
really,
you, Doric. I stopped you, Daniel.
Yeah.
So tell me, keep going about the unique features. Yeah.
Exactly. So the first one is, as I say, well, let me say a bit more about the first one because I kind of skipped over that. So greater flexibility. So I tend to use this kind of, I suppose, fairly tired old analogy these days that Sibelius Finale, if you think about what they were trying to do when they first appeared, is that they were trying to become a better way of making that page of music that you already kind of pretty much had planned out, than doing it by hand or by punch engraving or by stenciling or any of these other methods. So really it was about, hey, what the end result is going to be. The software is there to make you able to achieve that end result as quickly as possible. But really that process in Sibelius Finale starts after the composition is already complete. In other words, those tools are excellent typewriters, if we want to use the analogy with the written word, but they're not very good word processors. You wouldn't really these days ever start your novel by pulling out your old Crown typewriter and starting typing away because you want to have the flexibility that a word processor gives you in terms of moving material, developing things, swapping word order, moving entire chunks of text to a different place, cutting out a whole load, all this kind of stuff. And Sibelius and Finale, I think, are very much the typewriters of their generation. What we've tried to do with Dorico is make it the word processor, genuinely a word processor for music. And what that really amounts to is making it possible for you to do more natural musical manipulation of the material that you type into the program or you play into the program, much more in line with what people will already be familiar with from sequencers and things, programs like Cubase and Logic and so on. Those are kind of like the world's most incredibly advanced tape recorders where you can change the length of things and scale things and chop bits out and chop them in elsewhere. And notation software has kind of lagged behind those tools and their capabilities for things like composition and arrangement. And so our goal with Dorico is to build the same sorts of flexibility that you have in tools like Cubase and Logic and so on, and kind of apply them to the world of notation. Fantastic. So, for example, one great example of this is, Dorico has a couple of good examples. One is insert mode, so you can literally just press I while you're putting notes in Dorico, and then you can shuffle all the other music along. And if you've ever used Sibelius or Finale, you'll know that, for example, you have a tuplet, like a triplet or a quintuplet or something at the end of a bar, and you need to kind of insert some more material before it. And in both of those programs, that's really hard, because that tuplet kind of forms a sort of an inviolable box that can't be split and can't be moved. And we really wanted to make sure that in Dorico, because rhythm, of course, being, if you like, the main characteristic of music, art music over the last kind of century, really, is this kind of emancipation of rhythm, and all these incredible developments from everybody from Stravinsky onwards, basically, of really kind of working on rhythm.
I've seen you guys put on just samples of very complicated works being able to be input in through Dorico, and I'm just astonished at the complexity on screen that you can get with Dorico. I'm seeing just ridiculous time signatures, slurs, and I can't remember the example, but like there was a page where it's like the whole page was just full of stuff, and it looked great.
Yeah,
it looked great.
Yeah, I think that was probably a Ferneyhough example, and Ferneyhough, he actually does use Finale himself, and in a sense that's kind of a crime, because his hand, I've seen some of his autographed music, and he's got the most beautiful, precise, hand autograph work, and Finale in a sense can't ever, and maybe Dorico neither, can live up to sort of the beauty and the clarity of his handwork. But certainly his music, with all of its complicated tuplets that he sort of works out using pre-compositional processes that then produce these very, very complex nested rhythms and so on, those can be a bit of a bear to work with in other programs, but they're pretty easy in Dorico because it's got a very flexible kind of approach to rhythm
nature to Dorico. Now, what were the other two things you mentioned before I rudely interrupted you?
No. So the second one we've talked about, which was making the music look like real published music, but automatically, so that it was honouring the craft and the tradition of music engraving, not just for the sake of that craft and tradition, but also because it genuinely makes the music that you put in front of musicians to play easier for them to play correctly first time. There's just hundreds of little details that go into that a human engraver does based on their experience and based on their aesthetic taste and so on, that computer software has historically not really done, and which we have tried to imbue Dorico with some of that aesthetic sense, in terms of each of these little engines we've built to do these jobs, and to do it in a way that together produces a harmonious and proportioned page of music. And the third thing, yeah, I mean, again, the team just continues to amaze me and say, hey, we should do things like shorten the ledger lines when you have 30-second notes or shorter, and they're high above the stave, and and off they go, and we get these these tiny details that many users will never notice, but which the end result is not that you should notice them, but rather that you just find the music more pleasing to look at and easier to play. That's really the name of the game.
Great.
And the third and final area is that, given that we are part of Steinberg, which of course is a company that's been around for 34 years or something now, and which is really got an amazing, not just a legacy, but also a continuing present of innovation in the audio space, is that we really wanted to make Dorico sound great. And so we took the decision early on, and fortunately we've had the support of our colleagues in Hamburg at Steinberg HQ to do this, to basically bring Cubase's audio engine and use that as the heart, the MIDI and audio heart of Dorico, which means that you can use all of the same plugins you can use in Cubase. It means that over time we'll be able to build more sophisticated MIDI editing tools, so you can actually do quite a lot of detailed mock-up work directly in Dorico.
That was all planned, right? So you wanted to have that future where you could build towards with this foundation.
Exactly, and that's really, I think we wouldn't have been able to do that if we hadn't got the the combined resources and might of Steinberg's existing technology in that area, because just things like the audio signal processing that you have to do to have a mixer with inserts and sends and buses and all the rest of it, there's a huge amount of work that goes into making that work and be high performance and sound good and have accurate rendering and all the rest of it. And of course, all of that work has already been done and continues to be done by the team working on Cubase and Nuendo. So being able to basically effectively lop the heads off those applications and use their body and then sort of plonk Dorico's head on top and sort of stitch it on is an incredible opportunity for us.
Now, how is that point number 3 different from like a Sibelius, which has a rich library of sounds?
Yeah, it has a library of sounds, but it doesn't really have any tools to help you get the most out of them. I think that one of the biggest challenges.
Could you explain that a bit clearer?
Yeah, think about sample libraries and recorded sound and so on. The things that you really have to do to make a sample library really sing and sound like a human player might have had something to do with it, apart from just sitting in a dry recording studio playing every velocity of stroke on their down bow and then every up bow and then every pitch up and down the violin. It's got to have an enlivened kind of sense to it. And of course, if you're in a sequencer, the thing that you'll do is you'll just play it in live if you can. If you've got the keyboard skills to do it, you'll play it in live. And that way you immediately get a kind of human approach. And we will be adding live recording to Dorico. At the moment, you have to use step time. Yep. You can bring in a MIDI file and it will retain all of the sort of nuances of the MIDI file if you bring it in while keeping the notation clean, which is good. But you can't yet just kind of get a click going and record your line in and then figure it out in Dorico after that. But of course, so you can do that in Sibelius and indeed in Finale. But what you can't do is then get in there and start tweaking MIDI controllers. Some of these libraries require very sophisticated, effectively kind of MIDI programming, basically, to trigger particular behaviors. And so we sort of approached that in Sibelius with this whole sound world thing that we came up with a means of basically describing a kind of taxonomy of instrumental sound and playing techniques, and then a complex system of fallbacks and so on, so that hey, you've asked for muted pizzicato, but this particular library doesn't have muted pizzicato, so should I prefer mute or should I prefer pits, this kind of thing, and it would do that automatically.
I'm starting to see it. So it's very intelligently working with the playback system.
That's right. And basically giving the user, so I think especially these days, if you go back like 20 years, sample libraries were not a thing. We were all using outboard Roland sound canvases and Yamaha sound modules and so on, and Proteuses and Kurzweils and all of those things which are still kind of somehow sort of found tucked away in the corners of studios and so on. But certainly if you're going into college today, you're never going to have on your list of things to buy before you day one of music college, must get my Roland sound canvas. No, you might buy instead Hollywood Strings or Vienna Symphonic Library, or you might use the sounds that come with your scoring program. But to actually make them sound good, make them sound real, requires a lot of work, and you basically can't do that work in Finale and Sibelius, which means that if a mock-up that sounds like a genuine kind of orchestral performance with some verisimilitude is the end result that you need to get, then you basically have to bounce out of there into a sequencer with a MIDI file or whatever, and then do the work there.
So you can do it all in Dorico.
That's the goal. You can't do it all yet, but the idea behind having play mode with its dedicated piano roll editor,
that's really
drum
exciting.
edit.
Yeah.
And I think over time, the goal is not to turn Dorico into Cubase, but rather to provide useful enough MIDI editing tools that if you are working predominantly in a kind of the end result is, say, a mock-up plus some parts for the stuff you're going to record live to add a bit of color, something like that you should be able to do all of that inside Dorico without ever having to bounce out into your sequencer.
It's brilliant. Now, I'm very curious, what have some major people in the industry said about the software since its launch in 2016?
Yeah, I think the reception has been really, really encouraging. I think we have a tough road ahead of us because Finale and Sibelius are so well established, and most people who aren't coming into it for the first time, like a student, for example, arriving at Berkeley or wherever on day one, they've probably used Sibelius or Finale already, or are already users of those programs. So in a sense, we have to persuade, most people who are seeing Dorico are seeing it through the lens of some experience with another scoring program. So that does make it tougher for us, because it's much easier to find, one reason to say no. Because, hey, I need guitar tab, and, Dorico doesn't do guitar tab yet, and that would be a very good reason for you to say, do you know what, I'm going to stick with Sibelius or Finale.
Speaking of guitar tab, have you guys looked at like Guitar Pro or those kinds of software and kind of seen what they've done?
Yeah, I mean, Guitar Pro is an extraordinary bit of software, I think. It's really taken the whole approach to, I mean, again, not just guitar notation, but also guitar playback. They've done some really amazing stuff with their kind of real guitar engine, playback engine, and they've got a lot of very innovative ways of inputting the music. I mean, Guitar Pro is a pretty top-notch bit of software. If you're really into guitar stuff, and particularly that needs to involve tab, it's kind of almost hard to recommend anything else at this point.
Are there plans to integrate guitar, tablature, and guitar related? I know you guys have the chord symbols, the chords, the letters are there, right?
Exactly, yeah. So you can do pretty elaborate chord symbols. In fact, I think they're probably more elaborate, and they support more different kind of conventions. Because the thing about chord symbols, it's not just one language. It's like a language with many dialects and different musicians in different performance contexts. And like for example, you probably as a Berklee student learned something totally different than I did, because Berklee has its own kind of recommended way of doing chord symbols than other universities and establishments do around the place, and so on.
I know a lot of guitar people will be mad at me, but honestly speaking, just as a teacher and as a musician, I try to not get my students to do guitar tab. But I mean, I know a lot of people will be mad at me for that. I like to. It's important for me, just as a teacher, that the student is hearing the intervals within the scale as solfege rather than tab. It gets very easy with tab, but that's a completely different topic. But anyway,
yeah. I mean, I think certainly as a learning tool in terms of getting your fingers to do the right thing, to actually get some facility with the instrument. The
trouble is,
tab is great.
Once kids get the tab, it's very hard to break them out of that. They love it. It's just kind of. So the delay is I'm fine with the delay. Although I know a lot of my guitar listeners will be anxious waiting for that guitar tab, but it's fine.
Yeah, I mean, we will definitely work on it, and our philosophy really for adding things to Dorico,
does Sibelius have guitar tab?
It does, yeah, pretty good. Not amazing, but pretty good. And Finale, I think, likewise has pretty good guitar tab.
But so far, Guitar Pro, it seems to be the most developed. That's their thing, right? That's their thing, basically.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. That's kind of, they've spent a huge amount of time focusing just on that one area. Whereas for both Sibelius and Finale, it's just one of hundreds of different notations that they have to support, and it's the same with us in Dorico as well.
If you're a guitar student learning, please go easy on the tab. All I can say, just focus on using your ears and thinking within the scale. But anyway, I have to say tab is good for fingerstyle, because a lot of fingerstyle arrangements are very particular in where the notes are. But yeah, anyway, now let's talk about the big plans for the future. So you guys have been through major updates, 1.1, 1.2, and what's the future like? So these were the planned updates, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, when we brought out the first version of Dorico, back in October, 18 months ago or so now, obviously it was missing a bunch of stuff that people really needed. And, to some extent, of course, for things like Guitar Tab, it's still missing a bunch of things that people really need. And so we're still kind of filling in some of the gaps. It's always very difficult because on the one hand, we want to spend time doing the things that make Dorico stand apart from its competitors, and I think, lots of the things we've talked about, like its flexibility in inputs and editing, its musical way of thinking about things, support for multiple movements and large scale works is much better. It's got this unique desktop publishing engine with all these master pages and a whole frame based layout system. It's got the piano roll, so it's got a lot of unique stuff that the other programs just don't have at all. Right. But for some people, those things aren't necessarily worth a whole lot if it can't do Guitar Tab, or if it can't do jazz notations, or if it can't do whatever the thing might be, early music notations, figured bass, things like that.
I have two questions from jazzguitar.b, or two users. I was trying to solicit questions, and that's, you're talking about jazz. When is slash notation going to be released? What's the plan for slash notation?
Yeah, so we're actually working on that right now. We've been working on that for a little while.
This will get this guy excited, because I think he said he has a license, but that slash notation is holding him back.
Yeah, and of course, there's so much. I mean, it's not just in jazz, of course, but just any kind of, contemporary performance practice where there's, vamping or, whatever improvisatory elements, these sort of things. It's a pretty common notation, and you can kind of kludge it a bit at the moment in Dorico, but it doesn't work great. It's kind of like it used to be in older versions of Sibelius before we quite figured it out. Things like, it's all very well, you can put your slashes in, say, in your concert score for your alto sax or whatever, but when you then switch to the alto sax part, it's all transposed by a sixth and looks terrible. And
I get the sense that whenever you guys implement a new feature, you guys have to really thoughtfully do it, in the sense that you can't just tack it on as an added thing. You really have to consider the ramifications within the greater totality of the software.
No, you're exactly right. We really, obviously we spend a lot of time, we've kind of designed on one level a lot of functionality that still hasn't made it into the program, because we had this
exciting.
great,
Can you talk?
Well, I mean, I can't talk about it in too much detail, but I think what it is safe to say that when we started, we had this great luxury of knowing, hey, this is the kind of stuff that people want this software to do. So let's try to plan out a roadmap that accommodates as much of these kinds of, if you think about the way that a musician was working in, say, 1995 versus how they're working in 2015 or 2018 in terms of, the things they're required to have. People take it as read that you're going to produce a great looking score and a great looking set of parts. People take it as read that you're going to be able to produce some kind of rehearsal recording or mock-up that's going to sound good. People take it as read that you can do all that in a fraction of the time that you had to do that 20 years ago. So the software kind of has to address those needs kind of just as table stakes stuff. If it can't do that, it's useless. But then, to be able to actually think about how we could make the software not just be able to do something, but do something in a way that's actually supportive of the musical idea behind it, rather than just, so slash is a great example. On one level, a slash is just literally, it's kind of like a note. It has to go in the middle of a stave.
Yeah, it looks very easy.
Exactly. But the thing that we've really tried, as you say, to kind of think about, how do we make that integrate with the way that Dorico approaches things? How can we make it musical? So, for example, one really neat thing that we're doing with slashes is that, imagine you're doing a lead sheet where you basically have, a bunch of bars and you've just got some chord symbols, and you want to just fill that range with, fill the bars themselves with slashes. In Dorico, you can do that with one command. You literally just select those bars and then go fill it with slashes. And the neat thing is that then if you were to do something like change the time signature to, say, 6/8 from 2/4, those slashes will then automatically be converted to become compound beats. They'll become dotted slashes automatically without you having to worry about it. So it's always about, can we take something where the user has got kind of a musical outcome in mind, and can we make the program get to that musical outcome more quickly, more easily, and in a way that kind of they sort of imagine, hey, well, why hasn't it always worked like this? We always kind of aim for giving people an experience that feels so obvious that they kind of wondered how it could ever have worked any other way, basically.
All right, so Ted BPHX says, will there be an iOS version? Is there a plan, I guess, for a mini Dorico, like for in the future, like on the phone, where you can kind of do some quick editing? I
think, give us time. And yes, we've basically, again, from the beginning, approached Dorico in such a way that, the team have architected the program such that the underlying engine and what have you can be ported to any platform. It's all written in platform independent code. And so the challenge is that, of course, Dorico is quite a hungry application. It requires the resources of a desktop PC. But of course, you think about when we started in 2012, the iPad was like 2 years old then, and you see how incredibly the iPad has evolved, how much more memory it has, how much more powerful.
Computers are so powerful now anyway.
Yeah, exactly. So I think, you couldn't really have imagined in 2010 that would have been like the iPhone 4 would have been the version that was out. But now you look at the iPhone 10 and the incredible, basically desktop power on those processors. So, that level of that sort of side of things, and the fact that Dorico is a kind of a program that requires a decent amount of resources is not so much of an issue. I think what we would want to do, though, is make sure that we, again, figure out a way of getting the interface to work on those devices such that it feels natural and it feels convenient. And I think the crucial thing will be choosing which bits of the full-blown Dorico experience make sense to put on the phone or on the iPad, and which things kind of need to be kind of removed or simplified or whatever it might be. So we aren't working on it right now because we still have a very packed roadmap of things that our customers are
that's
waiting
my
for.
next question. My next question is, can you tease out a little bit of that roadmap? I'm sure everybody will be curious because we loved all the 1.1, 1.2, brilliant, and we want to know what's next for the development. What are the development team working on right now? If you can tell us, of course.
I can't say too much, but I've said a bit of stuff on the forum, so I can tell you at least what I've said on our forum. So one thing is obviously slashes, as I've mentioned. We've done a lot of work to really make them work as musically and as straightforwardly as we can, with a lot of flexibility in percussion and in writing, cues and all these other bits and bobs. So that's been a lot of work, and I think is shaping up really well. We're doing some work focused around the needs of MIDI musicians. If you're writing music for the recording session, for the scoring stage, there's particular requirements on how that music needs to look in terms of the conventions of that kind of world, which Dorico doesn't yet do. Certain things to do with bar numbers, to do with multi-bar rests, to do with time signatures. So we're addressing as many of those as we can in this version. We're also doing a load of work on staff management. So, one of the things that we're working on is a really nifty feature for divisi strings, and indeed for other things like divisi vocal lines and so on as well, which again are sort of one of those areas that people are sort of generally happy-ish with the way that they can do that in Sibelius Finale by adding extra staves and hiding them in various places and so on. But we're really striving for something much more musical in Dorico, so that you basically specify to Dorico how you want the division to work, and then all of the layout stuff, all of the labeling of the extra staves, and indeed determining whether there should be extra staves and all that stuff is all done completely automatically for you. So that's a big area of focus, plus some other things like osiers, which are needed for critical additions, performance additions, that kind of stuff, and also things like being able to change the number of staves that an instrument uses. So being able to do Ravel or Lachenmann or other pianistic work that requires 3 or even 4 or more staves. Some Xenakis stuff I think is on like 6 piano staves. So being able to do those kinds of things, plus load of improvements on playback and other things besides as well.
Do you have a tentative date timeline? Would we see it later on this year, or perhaps?
Yeah, later on this year, definitely. Yeah,
exciting.
Definitely later this year.
And how long is this roadmap? Do you guys like from your original vision, from when you guys were planning out Dorico? Is it fair to say there's still a whole lot left in your original vision that you guys still want to implement, that you're really excited to reveal to your customers?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I would say that what's been really good is that we are still sticking to that roadmap, and every day, if you like, Dorico becomes a little bit closer to that vision that we articulated together, sitting around whiteboards with no computers and all the rest of it in those early weeks of our start of our career at Steinberg. And so our customers kind of seem to be bought into that vision as well, and they seem to like the direction we're going, which is really great validation for us. But yes, I mean, we still have multiple years of things that we had dreamed up then. Plus, of course, we are getting, really great feedback from the thousands of customers that we now have, giving us all sorts of new ideas, new twists on the ideas that we already have. I'm sure that, I keep we sort of track our tasks in a number of ways. Stuff that we're actually working on goes in the central sort of task and bug tracker, but I would say that I also keep a little file on my computer that just little snippets of ideas that I get from customers whenever I'm seeing them in person or on the forum, or things that people tweet at me or whatever, and I probably add 2 or 3 things to that every single day, which might be big things, and there might be very small things that are good ideas from our customers about how to make the program better. So we are fortunately not in any likelihood to run out of things to work on for the foreseeable future.
Very quickly, what is the Dorico Award, and can you talk about that to some of the winners, the composers who won the Dorico Award? Yeah.
So we've been sponsoring now for the last couple of years the Scottish Awards for New Music, which is a really tremendous.
That's fantastic. I'm glad you're doing that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so important that we as makers of tools to support musicians also celebrate the work that musicians are doing. And New Music Scotland, which is the organisation that runs those awards, is an incredible. Scotland's such a tiny little country, obviously for everybody I'm sure knows where Scotland is, but people might think of it as just part of the UK, but it's got its own very particular scene up there. The Royal Conservatoire in Glasgow is, I think, it's just been ranked number 2 music institution in the entire world or something in terms of places to learn music. It's got an incredible, the BBC Scottish Symphony Orchestra is this incredible, up to the minute orchestra that's doing all sorts of incredible, modern performance practice stuff and really interesting work. And Scotland has this really vibrant community. And speaking as an outsider, as a namby-pamby southerner like I am, when I went up there a few weeks ago for the awards ceremony, what I was really struck by is what an incredibly supportive and close-knit community it is. All of these different organizations that are working in education to encourage the next generation of kids to get involved in music and composition, the people who are currently working, either studying or teaching at the conservatoire, at the other universities and colleges around Scotland, and how they're also supporting them the commissioning of new works. They're supporting the recording, the broadcast of new works. They're supporting festivals. It was really a wonderful thing to see just how vibrant that community is, and we're very proud to be supporting it. And
that's great. Any original music, and there's the idea that you're sponsoring and supporting original music of the new young artists, I think is very good. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're so, I was thrilled to actually be sat on the table as the young composer who actually won the Dorico Award this year, Matthew Grouse, and his piece 10 Seconds is definitely worth checking out on his SoundCloud page. It's a really interesting piece that combines a sort of a spoken word component, it kind of and lots of very interesting live and electroacoustic elements, and it's really, really interesting. And the sort of the breadth of the stuff that was being showcased at the awards was really, really, really inspiring, I must say, and really, really exciting to see that, and we're very proud to be able to be a part of it. I guess we've covered most things. The last thing I want to ask is, what are the are there any upcoming Dorico events that you want to mention that maybe we can check out?
Yeah, so obviously we do, as you mentioned earlier on, we do monthly live streams on YouTube to where people can ask our product specialist, my colleague John Barron. They can ask him pretty much any question they like about Dorico, and he will then cover that in a monthly live stream. That's always worth checking out. There'll be, there's one basically on either the last Wednesday or Thursday of every month. And if anybody who listens to the show is interested in finding out more, if you just go to youtube.com/Dorico, we have a channel there. You've already mentioned our tutorial videos and things up there as well, which my colleague Anthony works on.
Very, very helpful.
And so it's definitely worth subscribing to the YouTube channel. There's all sorts of good stuff on there. Upcoming will be at various conferences and shows. Music Messe, the big music show in Germany, is coming up in a few weeks, and we'll be there exhibiting along with the rest of the Steinberg product lines at Cubase. Some of our new hardware will be there, I think, as well, and we'll be there with Yamaha, who's Steinberg's corporate parent company. There's going to be all sorts of things, and if people want to find out where they can see Dorico, then a good place to look is the Dorico blog, which you can find at blog.dorico.com.
Wonderful. Daniel, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show and talking about Dorico. I think it's a wonderful, exciting piece of software. I'm a user myself, and I'm so glad to be an early adopter. I'm just getting all these new updates, and it's just getting better and better and better, and it's so fantastic. So I wish you all the best, and I wish your company all the best. I know it's going to be great, and I just hope more people get to hear about it, because it is really revolutionary software.
Thank you very much, Nikhil. Thanks for having me. I've really enjoyed it.